Well, thanks so much for listening in today. It's our great privilege as part of the work of Unio cum Christo, our International Reformed Journal, published by our friends in Jakarta and here in Westminster and Philadelphia, to interview one of the dear friends and professors extraordinaire of Westminster, Dr. Bill Edgar. And so I'm going to begin my time with Professor Edgar by asking him a little bit about his coming to faith and his connection with the renowned apologist Francis Schaeffer. And then secondly, we're going to learn a little bit about his work with the Seminary in Aix-en-Provence, now named for John Calvin. And then finally, we're going to interview him about his recent publication, perhaps his magnum opus, his book on culture called Created and Creating. So it's a great pleasure to have you listening in today. And Professor Edgar, welcome. It's good to be with you.
Thank you, Peter.
So you are one of those special men that God called to the Lord through a great apologist by the name of Francis Schaeffer. His wake touches a lot of us in our generation. I read his books, but you got to know him personally. Tell us a little bit about how that came about and how Schaeffer impacted your early life.
It's an unusual story. I was a sophomore at Harvard University and at best an agnostic and toying with atheism. And I had a professor at the college who was a Christian. And he, in his classes, in a very natural way, spoke about the Christian worldview. And I was quite drawn to this. And we became friends.
What was his name?
His name was Harold O.J. Brown.
Okay, well-known scholar.
Yeah. He's now in heaven. But he and I became friends, and he taught about all the different ins and outs of the Christian faith. And I was intellectually quite persuaded. Wasn't a believer yet. And I was going back to Switzerland in the summer with my brother, and we were going to do a bicycle trip. And so he wrote down on a piece of paper, Francis A. Schaeffer, and a telephone number. And he said, if you get a chance, you might want to look this guy up. He's a friend of mine. And he's an evangelical Christian like me. That's the term he used. So halfway through the summer, my brother wanted to go home. And I had some more time, and I thought, well, I'll call up Francis A. Schaeffer. And I did, and I was in Zurich, and Mrs. Schaeffer answered the phone and was very warm. I think Professor Brown had probably prompted them. But she invited me to come for the weekend. I thought, this is amazing. I don't know these people. Well, I did. I went down there, and I soon found out why. It was a Christian community. Where the main teacher, Francis Schaeffer, would give seminars, hold discussion groups, preach in the church. And then his dear wife, Edith, was the classic homemaker with meals for everyone, TLC. And
how many people were there when you showed up in that first time?
I want to say probably 25. It was small compared to what it was going to be.
Were most of them non-believers, do you think? Or
Yeah, a good number were non-believers. There were one or two who were Christians but were struggling. I would say most of them were probably unbelievers. Yeah. Wow. So it's a long story, but that night we had a discussion group where Francis Schaeffer answered all kinds of questions. The main one I remember is about prayer, and I hadn't thought about this.
Had you ever prayed before?
So I had said some prayers in the Episcopal Church because my parents sent me to an Episcopal boarding school where we had chapel. But I'd never prayed to God. I wasn't sure there was a God. And it was a fascinating, a riveting discussion on the way God answers prayer. And if he doesn't, if he's not there, prayer is one of the most futile things we could do. And I'd never heard anything like this. So then the next morning, as he wasn't preaching, his son-in-law was, he had time to talk to me. And we spent about an hour and a half together. During that conversation, I just knew it was true, and I felt my heart change. And
Did he share biblical texts with you about the gospel?
Yeah, the main question I remember asking him was about, this is embarrassing, even if Christianity is true, why is it relevant?
That's a question you're still asking to this day, isn't it?
And he gave about a 45-minute answer to that one, and he used what we call the free will argument for the problem of evil. It's an argument I've come to struggle with to some extent. I think bits of it are true, bits of it are not. Doesn't matter, it was mightily used of God, and at the end of this conversation, we talked about other things. He closed and he said, why don't we pray together? I said, that sounds fine. He said, well, you start. What do I say? And he said, well, why don't you start off thanking the Lord for what he's just shown you? And so, tears streaming down my eyes, I mumbled some sort of prayer, and then he finished. And then I asked him if I could stay for a while. And he said, well, we're very, very busy. I'll have to check, And they had some 20, 25 people there. Little did he know that very busy in the 70s would be 130, But they were crowded. And he found room for me. So I stayed the rest of the summer and took part in the life. All our meals were shared with Dr. Schaefer. And then after meals, we used to walk down a road to Pane, the Pane Road. And most of our questions that we didn't want to ask in front of everybody, we could ask in private, and he would answer them. He's just a remarkable resource.
Is this when you met Os Guinness as well?
Yeah, I met him the next
important
year.
For the book, you dedicated it to his honor.
Yes, I did. Well, Oz has been a very precious friend. We believe, we've talked about this, and we're not quite sure, but we believe the first time we actually met was in Boston, when he was traveling with Dr. Schaefer, the year after I became a believer. And he came to Harvard, where I was still a student. And he gave some speeches, and he was really the heir apparent, I think, in those days. It didn't quite work out that way. It worked out better, but that's our memory. And then we've been very fast friends ever since.
So if you look back at those moments and then the influence of Schaefer on your life through all these years, through his personality, his friendship, his teaching, what would you say is the greatest contribution of Francis Schaefer to the broader apologetic world and then to you personally?
So he was not only important to me, vitally important for the content of what he taught, but he modeled the way to speak the historic Christian position into the 20th century. And so often, even today in conversations with people, with unbelievers, I sort of hear Schaefer's voice, and I think, what would he say? And then I try to sound as wise as he. And so his influence on me is really monumental. And when I completed my final year at Harvard, I decided to go to seminary. And along with 7 or 8 of us from Harvard, we all decided to come here to Westminster. We'd been influenced by Edmund Clowney, who had been up there and spoken, and we thought, we want to be where this man is. And when I came down here, of course, I studied under Cornelius Van Til, and he was the second monumental influence on me. And I'd put it this way: on all of the details and fine points, doctrinal issues, apologetic methodology thought of academically, I would be a Van Tilian. He differed with Schaefer on various issues, and I would have to agree with the way he criticized Schaefer. On the other hand, Schaefer was such an enormous person and a gracious evangelist, and he had given his life sacrificially to spread the gospel to whosoever came up there, and then eventually made films, wrote books. And in that way, I think I would like to emulate Francis Schaefer. So I think I've got the best of both worlds, and it's these two great warriors that started me off in the Christian faith.
That's great. So as we turn our attention now to your ministry, as you left seminary and you began to serve, how did the Faculté Jean Calvin, or the ministry of the seminary in Aix-en-Provence, become so central for your life and career? You spent many years serving there.
Yeah, thanks. Well, as you know, I grew up in France, and so French was very much my first language. And we came to the States for maybe 7 years and then moved back to Europe, to French-speaking Switzerland. So French is in my blood. And then after seminary, I was a school teacher for a while. But
did you teach French, or what did you teach?
yeah, I started teaching French. You know, with all these degrees in Bible and counseling and things, I needed work, and we had a child, and I had to put bread on the table. And I put on my resume, at the very end, fluent in French. So my job was French teacher. They soon moved me into the music department, and
why was that?
well, I majored in music at Harvard. Music is, I thought I was going to be a professional musicologist until I encountered the gospel, and even then I might have done that, but I wanted to learn more about Christianity, and when I was learning more, I thought, this is so important, maybe I need to be doing church work. But it's a roundabout way. We did found a church in Greenwich, Connecticut when I was a school teacher there, and I still exercised my music gifts in all kinds of ways. The very kind headmaster allowed me to go to graduate school at Columbia in ethnomusicology. And so then a remarkable man came into our lives named Eugene Boyer, Eugène Boyer. He was a dedicated missionary in France, and he and several colleagues in Aix-en-Provence had just founded or reopened a little seminary, Protestant Evangelical Reformed Seminary, nestled in the University of Aix-en-Provence. And they needed a professor of apologetics. And he had to be fluent in French, he had to be Van Tillian, and there were other qualifications which narrowed it down so much that
there was only one person in the world that could do it.
Because by French law, you're supposed to find some French guy first, but I don't think they looked very hard, but they didn't find one. So my wife and I and our 2 children at that time moved to France in 1979, and I spent 11 years teaching apologetics there in the Reformed Seminary. It's a marvelous work, unique, because it's the only historically Reformed seminary in France. There is a Protestant Evangelical Seminary in Paris, which would be the other seminary, but we were the only historically Reformed seminary, and its mission was to renew the church and to send out church planters to found new churches, first in France, then in other French-speaking countries, Switzerland, Belgium.
So there were Reformed seminaries, but when you say historic Reformed, you mean maintaining a historic Calvinistic creed and confession?
Exactly. There were 3 other seminaries, one in Paris, one in Montpellier, and one in Strasbourg, but they were all pluralistic and liberal. And so if you were an evangelical and you believed in the doctrines of the Reformation, Aix-en-Provence was basically your only option. And I'm happy to say, more than 40 years later, it's going strong, it's thriving, its enrollment is robust. I go back at least once a year to teach there, and we've had the privilege of teaching at least one PhD student who is now the professor of apologetics. So Westminster is a conduit for good things. The professor of systematics, Paul Wells, was trained here at Westminster. He's retired now, but there's been a warm connection between our 2 seminaries.
Now, Bill, how has your love for music impacted your ministry from those early years at seminary all the way through X? You obviously mentioned ethnomusicology, so that's a fancy way of saying you're a jazz pianist. Right? How does that all worked into your theology and your ministry?
Well, marvelously, music and theology have always been close, and Luther recognized that. You know, he said something like, if you can't sing it, it's not worthy of the name theology. And Johann Sebastian Bach was an amateur theologian, and so the 2 have always gone together. I have a special interest in jazz music, as you said, partly because I just love the music and I grew up with it, partly because it has an amazing history. It was generated by African Americans during slavery and then beyond. And while I was at L'Abri, there was a remarkable teacher who ran the Dutch L'Abri named Hans Rookmacher. And he was the European expert on early American jazz.
Wow.
And he gave lectures on the origins of jazz, blues, and spirituals. And I loved this music anyway and played it. And I thought, this is wonderful that I can love it even more as a Christian for Christian reasons. So I've always tried to wed music into whatever ministry I was doing. Even today, I have a jazz band. And we do concerts where we explain the gospel illustrated with music. And I go to ethnomusicological and musicological professional societies and read papers and so on. So music has just been a very, very important part of my life.
Does jazz sound different through French ears than it does through English ears and American ears, or do we all hear it the same?
Yeah. I've thought about this a lot, and I've written on it. So the appropriation of jazz in France is a fascinating story. The French were the very earliest people to appreciate jazz for its aesthetic, which is an African American aesthetic. They appreciated it more than a lot of Americans, a lot of white Americans. And so early jazz heroes like Louis Armstrong and Sidney Bechet and many others found in France a home and much appreciation. So the French care passionately about jazz. There are even rival jazz clubs that disagree on the canonical list of acceptable jazz, and they're just passionate about it. So if you go to Paris today, there's at least 20 marvelous jazz clubs that you can go and hear just the best kind of jazz. So when we moved to France for work, it was no trouble to find jazz lovers and to form a little band, which we did, and went around and did concerts of all kinds. And whenever I go back, I usually play with some of these old friends. So the short answer is that the French love jazz. The longer answer is that there are reasons to do with French music. So there's a close affinity between people like Ravel or others and the principles of jazz. And then French people have had terrible suffering under the Nazis and much else. And so since jazz emerged out of a people deeply acquainted with suffering, they felt a kinship with that moaning and outcry that comes with jazz. Jazz is a joyful music, but it's joy through the valley of the shadow of death.
Okay, so Schaeffer and Van Til and jazz, what's the connection between those three?
Francis Schaeffer actually loved jazz, and his friendship with Hans Rookmacher deepened it. Now, I never talked to Van Til about jazz. I imagine he knew it. I don't know whether he enjoyed it or listened to it. But the theological connection is that both of them taught a kind of apologetics known by the somewhat awkward name of presuppositionalism. We're trying to change that to covenantal. I don't know if that's much better, but the idea is apologetics should not simply be proving to others the Christian faith by using bits and pieces, evidences out of context, but it should take into account the foundations of unbelief and challenge those at the level of unbelief. And jazz has deep foundations from a believing community. The greatest jazz musicians grew up in the church. Jazz owes its beginnings to the history of the spiritual, which owes its origins to the music of enslaved Africans who cried out to the Lord. So there are deep affinities theologically between this music that's called jazz and those theologies that deal with the problem of evil and that deal with grace and that deal with joy and love. So that makes a wonderful marriage between the kind of apologetics that we teach here and the kind of aesthetic principles that jazz embodies.
That's good. Well, it's a great joy for us to talk to Professor Edgar about his recent book, Created and Creating: A Biblical Theology of Culture, and it's published by IVP. It's dedicated to your friendship with Os Guinness, someone who brings your L'Abri experience to bear. And as we've been talking, I'm appreciating how your life has been shaped by many significant influences that make you uniquely qualified to write a book like this. Your international background, your mastery of different languages, your very erudite studies at Harvard, your musicology, your jazz piano work, your mission work, your living cross-culturally, your teaching and study at Westminster. What was the impetus for your writing this book? When did the idea come to you and how did it begin to percolate? I'm going to write this book.
Thank you, Peter. Those are very kind words, not deserved, but the impetus was, ever since I've become a Christian, I have believed in the interface of Christian faith and culture. And so the approach that has most convinced me as I study this interface comes from the general tradition of Abraham Kuyper, Francis Schaeffer, Cornelius Van Til, Klaus Schilder. And while you benefit greatly from other approaches and other traditions, I always wanted to write a book that would defend that approach, but from a biblical theological standpoint. And as I wasn't aware that that had been done, at least with the kind of detail that I wanted to do it with. There are other books. Al Walters wrote Creation Regained, and there's other books, but none of them does the kind of biblical theology that I wanted to do. So,
okay. So as you look at that language of biblical theology and you try to find its rootage, I know that you speak about the cultural mandate. Start with that first biblical thought and then show us how that gives us a direction to build a biblical theology of culture.
Sure. So biblical theology is the recognition of the Bible's revelation, particularly in view of its historical unfolding, culminating in Jesus Christ. And so I, in this book, tried to defend the ongoing validity of what you've called the cultural mandate, and what I call the cultural mandate. The cultural mandate is a term coined by Klaus Schilder, meant to describe God's first orders, his first commandments to our parents, Adam and Eve, and by implication to the rest of humanity. And it's given twice in succession in Genesis. And the basic idea is, first, before the face of God, to his glory, in covenant relationship with him, where he blesses us, to spread, multiply, populate the earth with a full panoply of human diversity, and to subdue the earth for God's glory. The word subdue means something like gentle lordship. So culture, as I understand it, is subduing the earth to the glory of God in an unfolding manner that brings more and more of his attributes and his virtues to light so that we can herald them. So in the book, I do argue that despite the fall, God has provided a way for us to continue to obey the cultural mandate. And there are many iterations of it given in the Old and the New Testament. And so I pause over many of them, not all of them, because there are too many.
Okay, let me stop you there and then just add this thought. There are other views of culture than the one you're developing. In fact, some would even say that culture is dangerous for the Christian. And I think your book talks about the negative texts or the Contra Mundum texts, like stay away from the world. That's a culture. How do we put those two together with the idea there's a positive sense of culture that's developing, and yet there's a danger to culture that somehow is antagonistic to God?
Yeah, certainly both are true. I love what the Apostle Paul says at the end of 1 Thessalonians. He says, prove all things, in other words, try them out. Retain what is good and eschew what is bad. And I think culture is one of those areas of life that we need to try out. Some of us by practicing the arts, others business, others law, family life, and so forth. All these different aspects of culture need to be proven. And then we need to hold on to what is still good, which the Word of God outlines for us. It's still good to work. It's still good to have families. It's still good to honor the civil magistrate. We're salt and light in this world. And then eschew the evil, and there's plenty of evil in human culture. I spend some time on the concept of the world. So sometimes it's presented positively. It's the place which God made. It's the place which God loves. Sometimes it's presented negatively, particularly in places like 1 John, where he tells us to avoid worldliness. And so we have to discern which aspects of culture are for us to enjoy and embrace and promote, and which are for us to stay away from. Worldliness, in John's sense, means the temptations to idolatry, to lust, to self-aggrandizement. And those are the works of the devil, not the works of the good Lord. So those warnings are very dire, but they're not warnings to stay away from all culture. They're warnings to stay away from the cancerous, sinful culture that has invaded us.
So at that point, there's two concepts that you develop. One is common grace, and another one is antithesis, the tension of the Christian with the worldly systems you're describing. How do those two work out, and some of the theologians behind those ideas?
Sure. Well, common grace is a concept that comes out of Scripture, but it was noticed and developed by people like John Calvin, and of course Abraham Kuyper and Cornelius Van Til spent a great deal of time developing it. And the basic idea is that God continues to look with favor on both his elect and his non-elect people. And that favor is not despite the fall and despite the antithesis, but it's in view of the antithesis. He wants to show that he is gracious and patient even on people who are not responding to the gospel. Now, in the end, of course, the antithesis will be more fully expressed in the judgment, and it won't be possible anymore for unbelievers to exercise their gifts. But as we wait, the wheat and the tares growing up together, there's a mixture, and it's not the time of judgment. So by God's common grace, we're to go engage in the world alongside unbelievers, fully aware that there is an antithesis. In fact, you couldn't call it grace if there weren't an antithesis. But also fully aware that we're in the time of God's patience, and that he is calling unbelievers to himself, and he's giving gifts to all kinds of people, whether they be followers of Christ or not. So common grace is a very important part of the whole idea of culture for Christians.
Okay, so the theologians Schilder and Kuyper had a debate at this point, and they're in the Reformed tradition in particular. How does that work out in our Reformed understanding of culture and common grace and the antithesis?
Yeah, so within those who accept the general idea of common grace, there are differences of its place, its meaning. Kuyper, for example, was more excited to build Christian institutions and to produce Christian culture without doing it alongside of unbelievers as much as someone like Schilder. So there would be these minor differences. There are some Reformed people who reject the idea of common grace altogether, or at least put it in such terms as that God doesn't sincerely offer the gospel to any non-elect person. Following Van Til, and I think following Scripture, I passionately disagree with that view, because it's a mystery. How can there be unelect people that are nevertheless somehow beneficiaries of God's grace and that are the objects of the offer of the gospel? How can it be sincere? And some theologians say, well, it can't. It's just, it's a piece of theater. We have to maybe say the words because that's what we're told to do, but it'll fall on deaf ears. The Bible says something quite different, that God does not enjoy the death of a sinner, and the gospel is preached to whosoever, and whosoever responds is responding to God's call. The call does not say, I'm going to preach to responsive people. It says, I'm going to preach to sinners. Now, it is true that that ultimately there is God's decree of election, but you can't get there. You can't get here from there. Can't get there from here. You can't say, okay, because of the decree, that means I can identify who's in and who's out. I can treat them differently. The Bible just doesn't do that. So culture is one of those areas where, as it happens, God has proffered a great deal of common grace on people who don't believe in him. Medical advances and artistic output and so forth. Some of it is quite extraordinary, but not produced by believers.
Okay. Along those lines, then, how would you contrast, let's take three philosophical systems, and how do they develop culture? You have Marx, you have postmodernists, and you have historic Christians. They all have a way of looking at the world. What is going on in each of their ways they're interpreting culture? And it's a big question, but try to, in as simply as you can, what's going on in their minds? How are they looking at culture?
Well, it is a big question. Karl Marx is a very important voice. He perhaps is the most influential commentator on economics and society since the end of the 19th century. Not right, but important. Basically, his view of culture is in terms of class struggle. So, as you know from his scheme, it's all about power. And there's an inevitable revolution when the proletariat, the working people, are able to rise up against the bourgeois who have power over them.
So they would destroy music and art and science in the name of that cultural view?
Well, they bring their own. They would not destroy all music and art. In fact, Marx had a certain place for music and the arts, as did Hegel. But he was so worried about the confusion of the arts with economic power that he encouraged the proletariat towards revolution and towards the destruction of their entire system. As you know, it never quite happened that way. It was applied in Russia, but in ways I don't think Marx was anticipating. But what Marx has taught us which we shouldn't embrace in toto, but it's important in itself, and that is that there is a power dimension to culture. Some people would say, oh no, it's only about meaning. It's only about, artistic pursuit. It's about beauty and so forth. But he rightly showed us that there's power involved, and that can be a good thing. Can also be a very dangerous thing. And Christians, I think, have been slow to see the power dimension. So postmodernism, which is increasingly out of fashion as a term, nevertheless represents...
What is its successor, would you say then?
Globalization, maybe?
Okay, why don't you answer it more of where you see
okay.
it going, okay?
All right. Globalization is the increasing interconnectedness of every part of human life. Certainly economic, but also communication, transportation, and most importantly, the idea that as an interconnected person, I have a certain awareness of the world and of my place in the world that pre-globalized people didn't have. So, I know that I can get on a plane and go to France tomorrow. That would not have been possible 100 years ago. And that gives me the mentality that I'm a global person. Some of that's good. Some of it is not good because we disperse ourselves into what we can do rather than concentrating on what we should do. But one of the effects of globalization on culture, one of the positive effects, is that it has opened up all kinds of windows to cultures and peoples that we wouldn't have had contact with otherwise. So, as I said earlier, I go to, let's say, an ethnomusicology conference. I was just at one in Washington a couple of weeks ago, and I went to a seminar on Balinese gamelan music, which is beautiful, beautiful orchestras from Bali. And I was enriched to find out the beauty that can be created by this wonderful music. But negatively, globalization can have the effect of steamrolling local cultures. So you can go almost anywhere in the world, and American pop music is much more listened to by young people than their own traditional indigenous music. And some of this is negative, I believe. And so as Christians, again, we learn that through the avenues that are open up to us, we have tremendous opportunity to preach the gospel all over the world. But we have to be aware that we should not bring to the world unwanted cultural accoutrements rather than developing local cultural accoutrements which can be redeemed. So the third group you mentioned, Christians, I think if they properly are armed with cultural awareness, will see power for what it is, but be aware of its dangers. We'll see globalization for what it is, but be aware of its negatives. And then we'll want to bring the gospel in its totality through the means that God is making available to us today. Here at Westminster, we're uniquely poised to do this because we have students from literally all over the world. I mean, you walk down one of our halls and it's the United Nations. Yeah. And so they will be learning some of the riches of Reformed theology and biblical theology, and then they'll be bringing them back to their different countries. And unlike the 19th century missionary, they won't have to be trained in language or cultural sensitivity and so forth because they come from there. I'm not saying there's no place for that, but we have this great privilege of being able to do that. So
then how does the Great Commission connect with the cultural mandate? I think you see there's a continuity in some way. The evangelism call, the missiological call with what God placed before man at the very beginning and your view of biblical theology. How do those two connect?
Right. Following Harvey Kahn, another one of my mentors, I believe the Great Commission is the cultural mandate put appropriately in a fallen world in need of grace. So, like the mandate given to our first parents, it tells us to multiply and spread all over the world. Unlike them, it tells us to do that as gospel heralds. Like the mandate to our first parents, we're to subdue the earth. And some of that still goes on, but in addition to what Adam and Eve knew, we bring the lordship of Christ over every area of life. Now, one of my favorite texts on that is Colossians 1:15 and following, where the second person of the Trinity's mediatorship of creation is compared to his mediatorship and his reconciling of all things in the era of the church. And so, and like the mandate given to our first parents, it's under God's covenant blessing. Jesus said, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me, and lo, I'm with you to the end of the age. So it's the same, but in a far greatly enhanced and corrective iteration, since there's been sin and the need for grace to overcome it. So there's tremendous continuity, but there's much more fulfillment and progress and enrichment.
So if we were to take our discussion about culture, is there a definition we can distill as to what culture is that everyone would agree on, or is that utterly impossible?
I think it's pretty impossible. After working on this for a long time, I've got my little definition that I've come up with. It's a bit.
Let's make sure we hear it.
Okay, well, it's a bit involved because it's basically restating the cultural mandate, but applying it to first cultural analysis. So how do some of the remarkable scholars and commentators that we've had in history, both Christian and non-Christian, help us to understand the way the world works and its culture? But second, also that there is a cultural dimension to the gospel. The gospel transforms every area of life, and that's a shorthand way of saying it changes culture. And third, I think it's important for us to look at both the meaning aspect of culture and the power dimension of culture. So culture carries meaning, it's full of symbols, and I give a lot of examples of that in the book. But it's not only about meaning, it is also about power, and I'm using that in a good sense, authority, proper exercise of institutional values and so forth. So all of that is wrapped up in what I think is the call to humanity today, and particularly to redeemed humanity, to engage in the cultural mandate as it's been enhanced and reinterpreted in the Great Commission.
Okay. So does that mean we should do politics?
Absolutely.
Christians should be involved in political parties?
Yes, absolutely. Now, it's a loaded question because there's ways to do politics and ways not to do politics. And I think you and I would agree that in the 80s, maybe some false hope was expressed by conservative Christians that if we could only participate in the American political process, we would see great change. And the great change doesn't seem to have happened. I mean, we've seen some good things. And part of the reason for that is that perhaps we were naive in the way we were looking to be engaged in politics. Politics is very complicated, somewhat unclean business. And unless you go in there with the gift to do so, and with a willingness to mix it up with people you don't agree with, and to arrive at compromise and so forth, you won't really be effective. You may keep your ideals, but you'll be ineffective. So, yeah, absolutely, Christians should get involved in politics. Some are called to be professional politicians. Most of us are called to be politically aware, to vote, to participate in local politics. And as you know, we've just been through a very difficult election, and it's always interesting to note that some of the people who are the most angry with the way things have come out on either side are people who didn't do much locally to begin with, and some of them didn't even vote. So I have little sympathy for that. Now politics isn't going to save the world any more than the arts or business, or any one false messianic hope for an institution. But we are in a battle at each level in every sphere for God's righteousness, and we can do our part and see a bit of progress if we keep our goals modest and don't think of a giant culture war where the white hats have to win everything. And just do God's work, and then, of course, beg Him for revival and awakening.
Do you believe that a healthy view of culture from a biblical perspective mandates some sort of a public proclamation, a public theology? And if so, how does culture inform that task?
Yeah, I believe very strongly that theology ought to be public, in the sense that many of the issues that theology deals with are of interest and germane to the public. And you could go through all of Jesus' teachings, and it'd actually be very hard to find any that were just private. His views on government, his views on poverty relief, his views on family, these things are of deep importance to the public. And I think a seminary like ours, if it keeps all of this theology to itself, is actually doing a disservice, and it's refusing to be the salt and light that we've been called to be. So it matters how you do public theology, but I think that we should be doing it is a no-brainer.
Okay, let's take some of the great names in the Christian tradition and tell us how they impacted your work, how they influenced your thinking. Let's take the names. C.S. Lewis, Abraham Kuyper, Francis Schaeffer, and Os Guinness. Those are four names I know that are important to your thinking. How have they shaped this book? What role did they play here?
The four of them in very different ways. C.S. Lewis, oddly, but perhaps tellingly, was quite hesitant to engage in culture in his theory. In his practice, he did a lot of that. And so I wrestled with him a great deal because he is one of my heroes. And his hesitancy, his reticence with culture, is because he doesn't want it to replace the worship of God. And so he wants us to guard against any kind of idolizing of culture. And in his day, there were people who were basically trying to do that. So he sees culture as maybe a preparation for the gospel, maybe to nurture our imagination, which is a wonderful way to be ready for seeing what God sees. But he did not advocate a Kuyperian kind of cultural transformation. We love him because he did it anyway, without
in spite of himself.
In spite of himself. And Francis Schaeffer was all about cultural apologetics. He not only used illustrations out of every realm of culture, but they practiced cultural engagement at L'Abri. For example, we had an arts festival there, which was very popular, and we encouraged young artists to come and learn and to paint and sculpt and dance and so on. So he was very aware of the incarnation of the gospel into cultural areas. And I think in some ways he was ahead of his time. For example, he wrote a little book called Pollution and the Death of Man. And he was very prescient about the dangers of pollution. And part of those dangers were not just ecological dangers, which he did care about, but were aesthetic dangers. I can remember when we were at L'Abri, It's on one side of a valley, and if you look up on the other side of the valley, there's these hideous smokestacks from some kind of factory up there. And he would rail against that. He said it's more expensive, but there's a way you can do that without having, smokestacks out in the air. So he was just very, very articulate on culture. He wrote a book about the arts. He wrote about the rise and fall of Western civilization. So he influenced me a great deal. Who else did you mention?
Van Til and Os Guinness, I think. I
Okay,
mentioned.
so Van Til, though he didn't say a great deal directly about cultural engagement, he constantly referred to Kuyper, the Kuyperian tradition, and to the wisdom of unbelievers. And very thoughtfully, of course, his area of specialty was philosophy, so he was very aware of that. But he also enjoyed literature. I have a friend who, because he helped take care of him in his latter years, was given Van Til's collection of the Harvard Classics. And he showed me this one day, and every page was annotated in these novels. Oh yes, this reminds me of Mozart, or oh yes, here's, he was terribly sensitive to that. So his presuppositional apologetics really grounded me in the possibility of a cultural awareness. And then, who was the last one?
Os Guinness?
Yeah, the senior moment here. Os Guinness has written extensively about culture. Although he's primarily a sociologist, he's very, very aware of history. A couple of his recent books, Renaissance and Freedom and some others, go through the cultural reasons why the West is in danger of losing its civilizational saltiness. And so he illustrates with, Greek literature, the arts, historical trends. He has this remarkable ability to find people who can have insights into the reasons why things are going one way or another. One of my favorite books of his is called Calling, or The Call, and it's about vocation. And he marshals an array of people who either say good things about calling and were called to do something good, such as John Newton, and when he gave up slavery, or bad things, such as Picasso, when he became obsessed with painting and couldn't free himself of his pagan obsessions. So, one of the reasons I dedicated the book to him and Jenny is they've been such mentors and friends and supporters. But one of them is that I think it's through Os Guinness that my eyes have been opened to some of the historical and social trends that I might not have seen without his teaching. We mentioned this earlier, he started at L'Abri, but he soon felt called to spread his own wings, so he went to Oxford, and he did a doctorate in sociology of religion under David Martin, and his doctoral dissertation was about the implications of Peter Berger's sociology for Christian apologetics. And he basically says Christian apologetics has been so tied to philosophy and the theistic proofs and that kind of thing that it has ignored the social dimension of human existence. So he pleads for the sociology of knowledge, plausibility structures, and he wrote extensively about that, and I think he's been able to effectively and almost single-handedly change the awareness of much of the Christian community on the importance of these things. So, yeah, those are four people, who have really influenced me. And as we come up to the Reformation celebration next year, I was just looking at Martin Luther And he famously said, three areas of life are in dire need of reformation: the preaching of the word, government, and the family. And so his Protestant Reformation was culturally aware, and I think without building on those shoulders, we probably wouldn't be doing what we're doing today.
So this book that you've written now on culture is coming out in the year of the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. What reformation do you hope your book will have on our understanding of culture, and how are you standing on the shoulders of the reformers as this work comes to light?
Well, it would be a little bit arrogant to suppose that would begin a reformation, but if people read it and were inspired, I would hope that it would be to recapture the seriousness with which the greatest Christians in history and our biblical heroes have celebrated culture, and whether it be awareness of cultural trends, or whether it be the cultural dimension of missions, worship, whether it be producing culture, the transformation of culture. That's a term that is controversial. Some people don't like it because it sounds triumphalistic. But I think if you say it properly, it's not triumphalistic. It's simply obedient. So if people could read the book and to be encouraged to engage culturally, I would be very encouraged. And although I have convictions in this area, I don't spend a lot of time in the book criticizing the views I disagree with. Some of them get a walk-on part, but I wanted the book to be mostly positive and cause people to reflect. So yeah, I mean, we here at Westminster and the Faculté Jean Calvin, we build on the Reformation heritage, which in turn builds on the best from Christian tradition going back to the apostles. And I think we have a modest part in continuing that trajectory.
How does your title encapsulate the main thrust of what you've tried to accomplish?
Yeah, actually InterVarsity Press suggested this title. And usually when a publisher suggests titles, I kick back, I push back. I don't care for it. But this one, I think, captured what I was trying to do. As you know, here at Westminster, under the influence of Van Til, we talk a lot about the creator-creature distinction. And you can think of the one little circle that he portrayed in his classrooms all the time. And I think created because we are God's creatures, and creating in turn as we reflect his creation, is a really nice way of putting that creator-creature distinction, as well as the positive calling to engage in culture. So the subtitle is A Biblical Theology of Culture, but I liked the sound of created and creating, and I hope it'll send a message that being God's creatures doesn't mean we're just constantly groveling under some dark shadow, but we're nobly carrying out the cultural mandate because we're image bearers. If people get that from it, I'll be very, very happy.
Is there anything that's outside the sweep of culture, and how does culture lead us into the eschaton?
Well, culture is this primary calling of the human race. So in that way, nothing is outside of it. However, if you want to be strict about it, God is not a cultural being. He created culture. Now, for sure he interacts with it, and the gospel comes with cultural clothing, but he's outside of it. And then I think worship, where we directly pray to God, honor him, sing to him, while it has to have a cultural dimension, I would be uncomfortable to call it a cultural activity. So many anthropologists study, human worship, and they think of it, oh, that's a cultural thing. It sounds relativistic to me. So I would say that doesn't directly fall under the purview of culture.
So is there culture after the end comes and the new beginning is upon us?
I believe so.
And what does that look like?
I don't know. No, I have a little chapter on that in this book. Some of it is from Revelation, some of it is inference. So when Jesus says, I will make you a ruler of 5 cities or 10 cities, or while that may not be completely literal, there's no reason to think there isn't rule over some entity like a city or a human grouping, and that's a cultural pursuit. When Revelation tells us the kings come marching into Jerusalem with their glory, the word glory probably has a reference to something like their treasures, but treasure is a cultural concept. When the world is destroyed, as 2 Peter puts it, I don't believe it's the good part, it's the cultural aspect, it's the positive, redeemed aspect that's being destroyed, but it's the cancer. And what will remain, will shine forever. And now we don't know what culture is going to be like in heaven. C.S. Lewis speculated on it, and it's fun to do that, but we don't know. We do know that we will be spiritual beings, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, and that the center of heaven will be Jesus Christ. And even as spiritual beings and worshiping him, whatever cultural activities there will be in order to draw us closer and closer to Jesus. The details, I'm dying to find out.
Okay. Is there jazz in heaven, Bill?
Yeah, this is a hard question actually, because if you say no, that means that all of the skill and the music and the improvisation, the compositional devices that have been used to make jazz or any other kind of music are kind of, extraneous. Not a waste of time, but irrelevant. I'm not willing to say that. I am willing to say that the kind of music we create here, to the extent that it glorifies God, and maybe to the extent that it needs further redeeming, certainly will be in heaven. And all that music in the book of Revelation, it's got to be to some tune. Is it going to be some unearthly, never heard before tune? I doubt it, any more than the words are.
So there might even be pianos along with the harps there, you think?
All right, now we're pushing it.
So you conclude your book by focusing on the fact that you did not try to make it directly applicable to all of life, but rather great principles and guidance to help us think it through. How does that work out? How would you like someone to take this book and then apply it in a specific area as they wrestle with issues of culture in their own unique calling?
Yeah, that's my biggest hope would be that they would do that, or I would do some of it myself. I'd like them to develop deeper thinking about the political realm, deeper thinking about the family, about the self, about the arts, and take some of those principles and then apply them, not just theoretically, but concretely. And some of that's already being done. Steve Turner has written a beautiful book called Imagine, and it's about the role of the biblical worldview in the arts. And he's a poet himself, and he's a journalist and so forth. And Calvin Searfeld has done this in the visual arts. James Skillen, our friend, has done some of that in the public civic realm. So it's beginning to be done, and I just think we need to do more of it. But I'd be encouraged if this book encouraged others to go and do that in their realm of specialty.
Okay. We've tried to pick up some of the highlights of your work. Is there something that we've overlooked that you'd really like to say? I want to say something about this.
No, I think you've done a great job. You mentioned the Contra Mundum texts. Those are texts which seem to say, don't have anything to do with the world, therefore don't have anything to do with culture. And I try to argue that that's not altogether what is being said. One of my favorite places to go when we're talking about the ongoing validity of culture is in 1 Timothy 4, where Paul warns his young friend and the rest of us through him that in the last days there will be doctrines of demons that will say things like, don't get married and don't enjoy food. And I go into some length about why he picked those two areas. Could have picked others. But I think, marriage says something about God's good intentions for us as families, and how celibacy in itself is no virtue. Again, going back to people like Martin Luther and Calvin, Luther thought extensively about and wrote about the evils of celibacy. He said, if there's 1 in 1,000 who are called to this, that would be a lot. And he talked about the temptations of staying celibate because you can't handle it, but much more about the beauties and the virtues of family. He, in fact, my colleague Carl Trueman argues that the Reformation did as much for removing a celibate culture and transforming it into a family culture as anything else. And then food, because in the New Testament, and I think to some extent still today, there's this whole cult of salvation through diet. I mean, the more sophisticated versions are Gnosticism, but there were all kinds of teachings that if you abstain from this or don't do that, then you'll be with the other elites in the line to be enlightened. And Paul rails against this because the gospel is not about slavery to eating rules or any other rules. It's about a relationship with Jesus Christ. And that too is, I think, part of the cultural mandate. We're to not only subdue the earth in every area of life, but in agriculture and produce food that's good. And so much of the celebration in the Bible is around the table, and heaven is portrayed as a banquet table with the Lord. So there may be other reasons, but I think that text shows us how God loves us to be culturally engaged, and how the opposite of that is a doctrine of demons.
Okay, let me wrap up with this, since we're talking about the Reformation, and you've done such great work in the Faculté Jean Calvin, and you're also a man who writes on culture and enjoys beautiful music. But Calvin, for somehow, was really struggling with music and maybe some of the arts. Where did the Reformed faith go wrong with Calvin? Have we corrected it? As we look at the Reformation and celebrating our great forefathers, do we go beyond them? How do we correct them? How do we celebrate them? In this regard, this is my last question.
Oh, that's a very, very good one. Again, it would require a lot of time to do justice to. So, if I would tremble to say, but I'm going to say it, that Calvin was a bit short-sighted in this area. Let me say, however, that he loved literature and knew something about Greek culture. So he was not anti-culture, acultural, but he was so zealous to purify worship and to rid it of all the different distractions that I think he threw the baby out with the bathwater. So that's why he wanted only the Psalms and a couple of other canticles sung with just the sparsest music. I mean, it's beautiful, And Marot's translations of the Psalms are gorgeous. In fact, even this fact that he wanted them translated and read it into poetry is a bit of a contradiction. But that was, I think, over the top. I mean, he took the organ out of St. Peter's. He wanted, didn't like Gregorian chant, all the rest of it. I think probably what happened is, in a great zeal to reform worship, there was a kind of iconoclasm which was a bit over the top. Now, Kuyper argues that taking the arts out of the church meant placing them where they really belong, which is in the world of culture. And so Kuyper, as a Dutchman, says, as the paintings and visual images were taken out of the church, they were put into the hands of extraordinary painters. And he celebrates the golden era of Dutch landscape art and, of course, Rembrandt. I think you could have it both ways, and I appreciate his zeal to justify Calvin. And I think he has a small point that the worldview that Calvin developed had great implications for the arts. But that worldview was only put into application in the arts generations later. I think the Lutherans did a better job. So part of your question was, should we refine and correct it? Absolutely. I mean, the Reformation was a wonderful time, but it was not a golden age. And so we need to build on what's good, and then look again at what needs to be developed and refined and so forth. So it's a happy thing that Reformed Christians are rediscovering the role of the arts, and we just hope they don't idolize them, needing another reformation of iconoclasm. But it's a happy development, and I think it's one that Calvin would have approved in seed form had he, gone to sleep and woken up several centuries later. He said, "Okay, this is what I started. I didn't know it was going to take this form, but it did." But yeah, definitely an insufficiency. Rookmacher called it a reformed mysticism, which was unhealthy. I don't know if that's the right term, but
So would you say that sinfulness can affect our aesthetic impulses?
Oh, I sure would, yeah. And Calvin was aware of the sinful impulse to take visual objects and, in the name of venerating them, actually to idolize them. And following Erasmus and many others, he thought the easiest thing is to just get them out. But there's a reverse kind of sinful reaction, which is, if I purify my life and I live in just a white living room and I have no art anywhere, I'm safe. But it's not
That doesn't
true.
work either.
Doesn't work either.
Well, Professor Edgar, what a joy to hear your reflections on your life, your ministry, and your work on culture. Westminster's been blessed by your work. What final thoughts do you have for those that are listening today about just their callings in life, whatever you might want to give us as your concluding salvo in light of this interview today?
Well, one of my mottos, which I think was deeply encouraged by African American people that I spent a lifetime studying, is not to seek happiness, but to seek joy. And the difference is, I think happiness is a superficial emotion that makes us feel good. Like if we had only dessert in our meals. Joy is a deeper emotion that is profoundly grateful and free, having been through the dark places and having tasted the way God can bring us through. As my students know, I like to say, neither optimism nor pessimism are biblical. The difference between the optimist and the pessimist is the optimist thinks we're in the best of all possible worlds, and the pessimist fears he may be right. And the problem with optimism is, the problem with pessimism is that it's not dark enough. So Sartre was a pessimist, but he's a lightweight compared to the author of Ecclesiastes, which really is dark, because our view of sin is terribly dark. My former teacher, C. John Miller, used to say, cheer up, you're far worse than you think. But then he would quickly add, but God is far greater and more powerful than you think. So optimism isn't bright enough. Optimism is Pollyanna, things are going to turn out okay. Whereas hope, Christian hope, means that, yeah, things are going to turn out, but it's not things that we're so deeply worried about. It's my relation to God. If that turns out all right, then I can be a truly joyful and hopeful person. Because if everything else goes well, but I don't have that, then life's not worth living.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. And to our viewers, make sure you get William Edgar's Created and Creating, a Biblical Theology of Culture. I imagine Professor Edgar would even sign it if you asked him to.
Glad to.
Thanks so much, Bill.
Okay,
Pleasure to be
Peter.
with you. God
Thank
bless.
you. That was
Okay.
great.